had gone through all the previous units under the ultimate review category for each of the units before our test review, but for units 8 and 9, I had not. So my goal here is to just walk you through units 8 and 9 to offer you some insight as to how these things are interwoven and really just to make sure that we have an organized understanding of the timeline for the second half of the 20th century, the 1900s. So, Unit 8 begins with the Cold War breaking out following World War II. And we have to remember that the Cold War is when the US enters its peak of international power. During this moment, the US would completely abandon its isolationist mindset that it had since the founding. We have to remember that with George Washington, he said to stay out of European affairs. But the Cold War basically led the United States to think about and find ways to intervene around the world in every imaginable way to promote democracy, capitalist cooperation, and most importantly, limit the spread of communism. Now, after World War II, we have to remember that Europe is in a horrible position, and it's because obviously it was the battlefronts of the Western Front, Eastern Front, and significant damage is done. And so, with that, the United States worries that with these countries having troubles with low standard of living, trying to recover, that they may turn to communism as a solution for its problems. And so when we see the post war European world, we see the Soviet Union begins bolstering its Western borders, what we call the Eastern Bloc. And that includes East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. And they basically become communist states to prevent the Soviet Union from being able to be invaded easily by, say, Western European powers. Now, the United States wants to allow for these countries to operate with democracy and to participate in the free market economy under a capitalist regime. And so the United States is going to try and stop the spread of communism beyond the Iron Curtain, as it was put by um, Winston Churchill. Now, President Truman, the man who dropped the two atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is the president emerging out of World War II in 1945. And he establishes pretty early on his Truman Doctrine, where he wants to help vulnerable countries like Greece and Turkey to make sure that the United States could secure them as allies and prevent them from going over to the side of communism. The worry that is if communism begins to spread, the US won't be able to contain it. It will have a bit of a domino effect, which would become later iterated by the Eisenhower administration. So Truman wants to try and contain communism, and his main way of doing this was through the Marshall Plan, where the United States provided economic support to many European nations to limit their political instability and to hopefully build further alliances. And so the United States became basically the construction team putting Europe back together with tons and tons of aid, again, to foster development, to prevent the spread of communism. And the Marshall Plan certainly brought the US into a more interventionist model. Now, outside of just providing aid, the United States would also form military alliances. The US would be a primary force in helping to form NATO, which was a security pact between Western nations like France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, England, etc., who would, in a situation where the Soviet Union and the US went to war, would go together. And this is another way in which, by creating a coordinated defense and to have the US having its allies in Europe, this would further, in their eyes, keep the war cold, right? Because if all these powers were brought in again, it would certainly be World War III. And the Soviet Union responds by forming their own iteration of this called the Warsaw Pact. And the Warsaw Pact basically combines these communist nations to form the same sort of defense fund. Now, an early example of the United States having to operate with a sense of containment was the Berlin Airlift. When the Soviet Union tried to blockade the Western powers out of Berlin, the capital, which had been divided amongst the four powers of Britain, the United States, France, and the Soviets. Now, the U.S. would continually drop for over almost a year, supplies, food, fuel, to make sure that the people there in Western Berlin would be able to, sustain themselves and that they would not succumb to communism. And while the blockade failed, it did demonstrate these early tensions that the Truman administration would face. Another big issue that the Truman administration faced was the Korean War, because North Korea, which was backed by the Soviet Union and China, invades the South in 1950 in order to liberate the South from Western powers, according to sort of the communist ideology of the North. Now, the U.S., working through the UN, would help to push back the communist forces, and the Korean War sort of ends in 1953 in a stalemate, where at the 38th parallel, we still see North and South Korea divided. And obviously, this war really has never ended. There are still heightened tensions between the North and the South Koreans. Now, while this was all happening on the home front, the U.S. is trying to stop the spread of communism at home. President Truman was criticized by some hardline Republicans that he was not doing enough to stop the spread of communism at home. So in 1947, Truman establishes the Loyalty Review Board, where he investigates the background of millions of federal employees, particularly in the State Department. This included leaders of the American Communist Party that were jailed for basically threatening the United States. And the United States formed what was called the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HWAC. And HWAC was known for trying to find spies within our government. And there were two high-profile spying incidents that helped bring on the Second Red Scare, which was, again, significant fears of communism. And while the Second Red Scare was mostly just pure paranoia, speculative, and had no basis in reality, there were two high-profile controversial spy cases. One was Alger Hiss, who was a member of the State Department, who worked with the Soviets supposedly by hollowing out pumpkins and passing along secret documents. Now, Alger Hiss was never caught for spying, but he was caught for perjury and for obstructing justice, because apparently he lied under oath in terms of knowing the Soviet spies that he was associated with, Whittaker Chambers. There was also the Rosenbergs, a couple who was found to be leading a spy ring, and ultimately who were found responsible for passing along atomic bomb secrets to the Soviets, allowing the Soviets to launch their first nuclear bombs in 1949. And so these two incidents really led to a significant moment of heightened fear, and this is what we call the era of McCarthyism. Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin was known to be the most hard-lined anti-communist in Congress and in the U.S. government in general. He was an extremist that claimed in a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, that he had the names of hundreds of communists who had infiltrated the State Department and the federal government. And McCarthy certainly was whipping up a frenzy in the name of getting more power for himself. He was found to be lying ultimately and censored, but significant damage was done, where hundreds of people's careers were ruined in Congress and beyond. An example of the paranoid McCarthyist issue were the creation of blacklists, where suspected communists were not allowed to get work ever again in their given industry, like the Hollywood 10, who were members of Hollywood, actors and actresses, and other people in Hollywood production who were found to be, suspected communists and were not able to work ever again in their industry. We would also see when Joseph McCarthy failed to find people in the State Department that were legitimate threats, he turned his attention to just looking for closeted homosexuals that he could target and try to oust as threats to our national security. And so McCarthy is really a sort of an artifact of this moment where this Red Scare whipped people up into a frenzy. And so as we approach the 1950s, we enter the era of Dwight Eisenhower. And Eisenhower was more aggressive than Truman. Eisenhower called for brinkmanship, where he wanted to bring the Soviets to the brink of war by threatening them with our atomic weaponry. He wanted to use our nuclear arsenal to basically scare the communists out of any aggression and spreading. And he was much more hardline. He didn't want to just contain communism, he wanted to back it up. Or try to get rid of it. And so his policy of brinkmanship just demonstrates how extreme people acted during this time period. Now, after the Eisenhower administration, we have the election of John F. Kennedy. And Kennedy, like Eisenhower, believed that the United States had a role in trying to contain and extinguish the blaze of communism. Kennedy characterized the United States as a volunteer fire department that had a responsibility to go into the third world and prevent those countries from becoming communists. This is a big deal because after World War II, a lot of the empires that Europe had began to fall apart as Europe itself began to recover from the Second World War. And when these countries began to decolonize, the United States and the CIA used its spy agency tactics in order to organize coups in foreign governments. One example of that is in Iran, where Reza Shah overthrew the Iranian government and provided the U.S. access to oil after Mossadegh was going to cut the United States off from Iranian oil. So this secures U.S. interests abroad and keeps us in line, or keeps these countries in line with U.S. interests. We see other examples of this in Guatemala, where a leftist leader named Jacobo Arbenz um, tried to return land from Guatemala that the United States basically occupied for corporate gain back to Guatemalans. And after Jacobo Arbenz was overthrown, he lived out the rest of his life in Mexico under threat of assassination. And so the United States was getting involved in these third world countries who were beginning to sort of show signs of communism and anti-United States interests. We also see this in Congo, where the United States assisted in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, who was a leftist, and brought in anti communist dictator Mobutu, who was a ruthless dictator, killed thousands, and the U.S. supplied him with weaponry, financial support, and other issues. Now, one of the biggest example of the Bay of Pig, or excuse me, of intervening in the third world was the Bay of Pigs invasion under President Kennedy, where the United States tried to create an uprising with former Cubans who were sent back to Cuba to whip up an uprising and try to overthrow the Castro regime. Now, the people that tried to ultimately, you know, bring this forward, the Bay of Pigs failed at doing so, and Castro would stick around and collaborate with the Soviets. This ultimately led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviets were going to station high powered nuclear weapons in Cuba, pointing them at the United States, leading to a really big standoff under the Kennedy presidency and bringing us to the closest moment of nuclear war that we ever had. While this is all going on during the Cold War on the home front, we also have people returning home from World War II, creating a unique culture and a very affluent society. So after World War II, America is in a prime position of wealth as we are sort of carrying out our Marshall Plan. We have lots of money. We have very high production of goods and manufacturing. America is at its pinnacle in terms of its wealth. And in turn, the United States, to help its GIs return home from war, passed what was called the GI Bill, which gave loans for houses, free college tuition to veterans, and many other programs to allow for them to readjust to society after returning home from war. Now, this economic prosperity and security for a lot of these people created the conditions that would allow for a baby boom, where many people returning from war who had lived through the Great Depression and then ultimately World War II finally were in a position of prosperity and had many, many, many children in the United States. Now, along with the baby boom came demand for housing, and this is what led to the creation of suburbs. A great example of the sort of Cold War 1950s suburbanization were the creation of Levitt towns on Long Island and in Pennsylvania. Levitt towns were these neighborhoods with row houses that looked extremely similar to one another and that could be put up with a rapid pace. It was like the assembly line, but for building neighborhoods. And suburbanization basically created this unique culture in the 1950s with these sort of car driving, ideal nuclear families where everybody was encouraged to have kids and sort of conformed to this suburban lifestyle. Now, one of the things that allowed for the creation of suburbs was that the Eisenhower administration spent a good amount of money on developing the highway system. These highways allowed people to drive their cars to and from the workplace. It also allowed for the United States to be prepared for a military invasion by the Soviet Union because the roads were wide enough to get our tanks across the country. and to move things very quickly, right? Mobilization. But the Interstate Highway Act was all about, basically creating and connecting these urban centers to these suburban sprawl. And this was exemplified very much so in the Sun Belt, where Americans began the process in the 1950s of moving south for military defense jobs on military bases in the defense industry, where the United States, after World War II, was having a high tech moment of development. To help our military industrial complex, right? This relationship between private businesses and the military. Also, in the South, it helped that there was the development of air conditioning, lower taxes, and cheaper housing available for people. Now, in the 50s, it's characterized by this sort of image of the nuclear family, a husband and wife and their children living in a common residence, with a husband that would go to work and a woman sort of living in the home front, tending the house and raising the children. This is kind of a return of the cult of domesticity after women were sort of given greater opportunities during World War II, as we saw with like the Rosie the Riveter image. And along with this came sort of a popular culture, which sort of reiterated or encouraged a further conformity to culture. We saw TV shows with Leave It to Beaver and I Love Lucy, with a husband and wife, their children, dealing with very mundane problems that typical people would face. And it often reinforced these gender roles of the nuclear family, where a husband would go to work, come home, the wife would greet him with dinner, the family would put the kids through school, they'd go to college, they'd attend a university. And this is sort of the typical trajectory of the American family in the 1950s. And with the baby boomers sort of being born in the late 1940s and the early 1950s, there was a really big popular culture which reflected their livelihood, where in soft ways, kids could be slightly rebellious from their parents with like rock and roll. But a lot of the popular culture reinforced like religious faith, patriotism, and conformity to societal norms like the cult of domesticity and the roles for boys and girls, men and women. But not everybody subscribed to this conformity. And we have the beatniks arising in the 1950s who rejected the materialism, consumerism, and the conformity to conventional society. They listened to jazz music and expressed themselves through art and poetry, and often, had a little bit more of a liberal stance in terms of their social values. Now, while the government was creating these suburbs, the Homeowner Loan Corporation or Lending Corporation, which was created after the New Deal, gave loans to people in green and blue areas, often to people that fought during World War II, creating these suburbs. But not everybody got access to these loans. Mostly immigrants and African Americans were not allowed to get these loans. They were seen as being fundamentally more risky. And this made it so that in the United States, we have this divide where suburbs became accessible to white families, leading to this prosperous middle class wealth. Whereas in our cities, they become poorer and poorer, and it becomes very obvious that there is a gap both in standard of living between the suburbs and the cities, but also that occurs along racial lines, where mostly black families were left to live in the cities, and resources leaving the cities ultimately made it so that these folks were just simply poorer. And this led to a call for change and a degree of economic and civil rights equality, leading to the civil rights movement. Now, we have to remember that in the late 1800s, in 1897, the case of Plessy versus Ferguson determined that segregation was allowed in the United States. Now, starting in 1909, the NAACP was a progressive era foundation which tried to fight against segregation policies and to directly challenge this institution of segregation. No coincidence, it was founded by W.E.B. Du Bois, an intellectual who felt as though that we needed to fight against inequality more directly, unlike Booker T. Washington, who wanted to work within the system of segregation. Now, the NAACP had its most significant victory in U.S. history in 1954, when Brown versus the Board of Education led to the overturning of Plessy versus Ferguson. This meant that now segregation would be banned in schools, and it would lead to the integration of schools for young children. It also signaled that the NAACP would play a big presence on the court, as we see Thurgood Marshall, NAACP attorney, would become a future justice on the Supreme Court and one of the first black justices in U.S. history. Now, just because Plessy versus Ferguson was overturned didn't mean that the South was going to roll over and allow for this to happen. The South actually organized amongst the Southern leadership, leading to the creation of the Southern Manifesto, who believed that the Supreme Court had gone too far, were stepping on state authorities, and basically dismantling the life in the South, which had emerged out of Reconstruction, where whites in the Jim Crow era had a much better standard of living than blacks, had greater opportunities economically and with education. And in turn, as we saw with the Little Rock Nine, the first black high schoolers to go and integrate Southern high schools, the Little Rock Nine was prevented from entering Central High School as Governor Orville Faubus sort of brought in the National Guard to prevent these students from entering. It would take Dwight Eisenhower to bring in the U.S. military to escort these kids into class. And even though they were able to get access to the school, not many of them end up graduating from Central. So this demonstrates both the victories of the civil rights movement, but also some of the pushback from people in the South during this time period. Now, a year after Brown versus the Board of Education, a young man by the name of Emmett Till was murdered in Mississippi. And his murder led to his mother holding an open casket funeral, which led to many people in the South to call for change and attempts to directly address these issues in the South, including lynchings and including basically black folks being treated as a second-class citizen. A year within that year, in Montgomery, we see Rosa Parks, who refuses to get off of her seat in the whites only section, which kicked off a year-long bus boycott in Montgomery. Now, Rosa Parks was an activist in the NAACP. She was not some random old lady that sat on a bus and coincidentally refused to sit. This was a coordinated effort by the NAACP. And ultimately, Rosa Parks stems off the bus boycotts, and this leads to another ruling a year later in which we see buses are forced to integrate. And so we see incremental change, but for some people, it was simply not enough. And these early victories encouraged further progress and further movements towards the fight for civil rights. And MLK is going to map out this vision for a nonviolent civil rights movement in his letter from Birmingham jail, where he wants people to break unjust laws and to fight back against the injustices in the South. He wants to do this through nonviolent protests. And this largely manifests through sit-ins, the freedom rides, boycotts, and marches. And these non-violent protests were meant to create tension, which would lead to change. As you can see here on the left, sit-ins were called upon to draw attention to the poor treatment of black folks and other people that stood for civil rights in the South. And so groups, for example, like SNCC and the SCLC, SNCC stands for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference sort of coalesce around this idea that if we use nonviolent protests, we can generate change. But not all groups subscribe to this model. For example, the Black Panther Party wanted much more radical change. These were Marxists who employed much greater radical ideas. Their 10-point plan called for an overhaul of the government, the dismantling of capitalism, the freeing of all black folks in prison. These were much bigger claims and calls for civil rights sort of overhauls compared to SNCC and the SCLC. We're also going to see that the Black civil rights movement inspires a second wave of feminism, where women who were tired of the Cold War nuclear family called for greater change, like bodily autonomy and a fight against objectification. They used tactics similar to MLK, and they ultimately called for an Equal Rights Amendment, which would be added to the Civil Rights Act in 1964. We see this with Title IX, which is ultimately added in the early 1970s. But that being said, the second wave of feminism is inspired by the Black civil rights movement and would lead to victories like we see with Roe v. Wade. We're also going to see an American Indian movement that occupied Alcatraz outside of San Francisco, occupied the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Wounded Knee, where in the 1800s, Native Americans were crushed by the U.S. military. Ultimately, this sort of shows another example of the expansion of the civil rights movement. We're also going to see this with the gay rights movement, with the Mattachine Society, who held sit-ins going to gay bars which had been raided to make sure that gay patrons could be served. From there, we're going to see the United Farm Workers Association, where Mexican migrants who came to the US to work in agricultural work fought for workers' rights and for greater activists, or should I say, greater activism to challenge the use of like DDT on their plantations. And Hugo Chavez, or excuse me, not Hugo Chavez, but Cesar Chavez organizes a hunger strike in order to get his way to try to help with the collective bargaining. You could see him sitting here with Bobby Kennedy's brother of JFK. And finally, we see the progress of an environmentalist movement as in the early 1950s, we see Silver Spring was written, which exposed the use of DDT. In later environmental disasters like the Cuyahoga Fire in Chicago, in Cleveland, and Love Canal in Niagara Falls led to people calling for greater awareness for environmental change. And this led to like the creation of the EPA, for example. Now, from there, we're going to see that in the late 1960s, LBJ is going to respond to the civil rights movement by creating the Great Society, which was a New Deal style package in order to help fight against urban and rural poverty. He also wanted to expand civil rights, and we see this through key legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned discrimination in private employment and schooling, the Voting Rights Act, which banned discrimination at the polls and got rid of literacy tests. He also opens up the door to immigration, getting rid of these national origin quotas that were established in the 1920s. And finally, we see a poll tax is finally banned by the 24th Amendment. All of these issues are targeted at creating greater equality. We're also going to see in the late 1960s some very important Supreme Court decisions which have liberal bases, like Loving versus Virginia, which eliminated interracial marriage, Gideon v. Wainwright, which allowed for people that were poor to be given an attorney for free if they couldn't afford one, and Engel versus Vitale, which banned teacher led prayer in public schools. And finally, the Great Society, which was geared at closing the education and wealth gap between rich and poor, has many programs which are very successful in trying to prevent, again, the poor from falling behind. We see welfare programs like the Food Stamp Act. We see greater liberal policies where Medicare and Medicaid are established to help the poor and to help the elderly to get medical insurance. And there are many others which are significant here. But while LBJ is successful with his Great Society, what he failed to do was find success in foreign policy with the war in Vietnam. Now, Vietnam is an extension of the Cold War, where the United States was trying to limit the spread of communism to Vietnam. Now, Vietnam had been a French colony, and after World War II, when the Vietnamese have a burgeoning communist movement under Ho Chi Minh, the French go to try to retake the colony, and the United States would back the French with over $10 billion in support. But unfortunately for the United States and the French, the Vietnamese are able to defeat the United States with power backed by Mao Zedong, who provided weapons and military training. Now, after the war with the French, they divide Vietnam up into the North and the South. The North was backed by the Soviet Union and China, while the South was backed by the United States. And in the South, we see a growing call for communism. And supposedly there was going to be an election held 2 years later. But unfortunately, what we're going to see is that in this election, President DM or ZM, who we support from the South, declares himself the winner. He becomes incredibly unpopular, and the United States allows for him to become assassinated. Now, later that year, the U.S., which had sent military advisors to help the South sort of stave off communism, is going to end up ramping up our effort for the war effort following the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where in 1964, the U.S. claimed that a ship was attacked by the North Vietnamese, and after the Gulf of Tonkin, the U.S. is going to send people to war. Now, this war is a disaster for the United States because our tactics don't work against the guerrilla warfare of the Vietnamese. The US was used to fighting people who wore uniforms, who were very obviously members of the oppositional force, but they fight a guerrilla war in Vietnam, and the US tactics like Operation Rolling Thunder, where we bombed the crap out of the Vietnamese, is largely unsuccessful. So we had to put boots on the ground, and we would often do search and destroy missions where the US would go into the jungle looking for Vietnamese who would be, deemed Viet Cong or Viet Minh. Now, unfortunately for the United States, it was very difficult to tell who was an enemy and who was a civilian. And so we had moments like the My Lai massacre in 1967, where the US killed over 500 civilians. And moments like this would be televised in the United States, making the war less and less popular with the American people.
The outskirts.
Now, the people that were fighting this war, many of them were drafted. And while there were some exceptions, many of the people that were forced to fight this war felt as though it didn't serve their interests. And people began calling into question, why are we fighting this war in the first place? There were many young people, like the Students for a Democratic Society, who've developed the counterculture, the hippie movement, and who called for peace, who protested the Vietnamese War in order to try to get the United States out of there and allowed Vietnam to basically do what the Vietnamese wanted. And unfortunately, during some of these protests, we would see that the federal government, or should I say in this case, the Ohio government, would crack down on protests. For example, at Kent State University, Vietnam protesters were shot and killed, and this further entrenched the division between pro-Vietnam supporters and anti-Vietnam supporters. Things went haywire, though, when the Pentagon Papers were exposed, where the federal government was seen as lying to people in the United States. This led to a credibility gap where people found out that the federal government was lying to them, and this helped bring the United States out of the war. Ultimately, the US would withdraw from the war in Vietnam, and Vietnam would become a communist government. Now, to limit the power of the federal government going forward after the war in Vietnam, two different policies were passed. One is the War Powers Act, where the United States would have to have an official declaration of war anytime that it put boots on the ground. And in addition to that, we would see the passage of the 26th Amendment, where the United States would lower the voting age to 18 because people during this time who were being drafted could not vote for people or policies that supported them or supported their ideals. And so the war in Vietnam led to some significant changes. At the end of the Vietnam War, we would see the election of our first major um, sort of element of the conservative movement, but the conservative movement was sort of developing during the Vietnam War in the 1960s as opposition to liberal policies like the Great Society. We have to remember that liberals tend to favor government intervention, where conservatives tend to favor a weaker government that promote liberty and traditional values. An example of conservatism economically was that of Herbert Hoover during the 1920s, and examples of liberalism we could see all over the 40s, 50s, and 60s with the New Deal, the GI Bill, the interstate highway system, and the Great Society. Now, in 2024, we see that conservatives tend to dominate the South, but that was not always the case in the 1960s. It would take policies like the Great Society, with LBJ promoting civil rights and an expanded government, to basically drive the South away from the Democratic Party. In turn, they turned to Barry Goldwater, who was a thinker who basically pushed back against the rise of big government and who was against LBJ in general. Now, Barry Goldwater was backed by social conservatives like the John Birch Society that were anti-communist and anti-hippie, who wanted a return to traditional values, and folks like Phyllis Schlafly, who would oppose the Equal Rights Amendment and progress made by the second wave of feminism. And so in 1964, we would see the South turned to Barry Goldwater and the conservatives. They would once again turn to the conservatives in 1968 when Richard Nixon is elected, who spoke to bringing law and order and pushing back against sort of the craziness of the civil rights movement. Now, Nixon was billed as a pretty significant conservative, but he was more or less moderate. He expanded the environmentalist movement, and the Supreme Court official that he promotes, the Burger Court, ultimately passes Roe v. Wade. Now, he was elected twice, but during the second time he was elected in 1972, he was caught cheating with the Watergate scandal, and Nixon ultimately had to resign because he was found destroying evidence during the investigation. This led to the election of Jimmy Carter, whose election was basically marked by stagflation and a horrible economy in the 1970s, who called for people to make economic sacrifices. Because the Democratic Party could not manage the issues of the 1970s, Ronald Reagan would enter as the first true conservative in the 1980s. He made an appeal to conservative social values. He wanted massive tax cuts and deregulation. And we call his policies Reaganomics. Now, Reagan would play an instrumental role in trying to bring an end to the Cold War. Now, Nixon, sort of following Vietnam, tries to ease tensions with the Soviet Union by creating a policy of détente, where he tried to sort of limit the scope of nuclear proliferation. But Reagan, when he comes into power in 1980, began to reopen the sort of hard-lined, hawkish arms race that we saw under President Eisenhower. And so, for example, President Reagan is going to have the SDI, where he spends to create a defense initiative, which would sort of leverage the technology of the space race. Now, because the Soviet Union couldn't keep up with all of that spending, the U.S. would drive the Soviet Union to bankruptcy. We saw this where in 1989, the Berlin Wall would fall, and in 1990, the Soviet Union opened up to communism, where in 1991, the Cold War would end. Now, in turn, the US turned its power to its next big rival as the Soviet Union was winding down, where in the Middle East we see some leaders speaking out against the United States, like Saddam Hussein. And when Saddam invaded Kuwait, the United States intervened in Desert Storm. Now, while in Desert Storm, the U.S. stationed troops in two Saudi Arabian holy cities, Mecca and Medina. Now, some extremist groups who opposed the United States' support for Israel throughout the Cold War and also the U.S.'s occupation of these two cities end up calling for the United States' downfall. And we see this with Osama bin Laden, who would form Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda carried out the September 11th attacks in 2001, targeted at the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. This led to the passing of the Patriot Act, where the federal government was given mass power of surveillance, which ultimately was scaled back because it allowed the government to really survey the American people. We also saw a rise of Islamophobia in the United States, where hate crimes and racial profiling were on the rise after 9/11. This basically made it so that we see a new layer of nativism which emerges during this time period. And finally, it was found that the United States were fabricating evidence to enter the war in Iraq in 2003 when Colin Powell at the UN claimed that the United States had knowledge of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, where we go and invade without any knowledge and never find them. This basically made it so that the United States enters under false pretenses, and it opens up this conflict in the Middle East further. Now, throughout the 90s and 2000s, we would additionally see a massive change in American labor and immigration. One issue was that the United States ended up signing free trade agreements, which sent many jobs away from the United States to places like China. This led to many of the jobs in manufacturing, which had emerged in the market revolution and into the Gilded Age, to basically go to other countries around the world. Throughout the late 1900s, we would see that those jobs, through free trade agreements, would go to other countries. We would also see unions who would struggle to collectively bargainize under more conservative policies. And with the internet basically replacing these jobs, creating more white-collar positions, we would see that the United States basically lost its manufacturing work, which had emerged over the 1800s, and would be sent abroad. Now, during this time period, we would also see that the middle class wages would stagnate and the rich would become incredibly wealthy over the course of the early 2000s as the internet age created folks like Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, and Elon Musk. Now, from there, we would also see a rapid change in immigration. Throughout the 1900s, people continued moving to the South. For example, we saw in the Cold War, people moved to the South for cheaper work. We would also see the military industrial complex sort of moves to the South. But in general, many Black folks also returned to the South because of the close of the Jim Crow era. And this made the South a much more formidable political force. That being said, we also saw significant immigration from outside the country. The United States opened up its borders during the Great Society, but would further sort of create and reinforce this idea of immigration with amnesty being seen under the Immigration Reform and Control Act under President Reagan, which encouraged people to further immigrate illegally to the United States as amnesty was granted to illegal immigrants who had lived in the country for over 4 years. Now, most economists believe that immigrants have provided a really significant boost to our economy, and immigration today is still an issue which we debate. Okay, folks, that's Unit 8 and 9. Thanks.